The wind carried the scent of salt and oil as I stood on the dock, watching the largest of our freighters ease into the harbor. The Calloway Atlantic was the pride of our fleet, a 250-meter beast that had crossed oceans and brought back fortunes. I took pride in the way she moved, slow and deliberate, like she knew she belonged here. This port, this company, Calloway Shipping and Trade, was more than just a business. It was a dynasty, one my father, Lawrence Calloway, had built brick by brick and wave by wave. When he passed, the weight of it fell on me. I hadn't questioned it. Calloways didn't shrink from responsibility. "Ethan," a voice called from behind. I turned to see David, my eldest son, standing tall against the early morning sun. He'd inherited my height and seriousness, though his gaze was sharper, always scanning for cracks I might have missed. "She's holding up well," David said, nodding toward the Atlantic. "She should be," I replied. "We put enough into the retrofit last year." David folded his arms, watching the crew unload the containers. He'd been shadowing me more closely these last few months, taking an active role in the business. It felt good to have him by my side. I trusted David, something I couldn't say about everyone else in the family. "Your grandmother called," he said casually, but there was a flicker of tension beneath his voice. "Charlotte?" I asked, already knowing the answer. David nodded. "She wants a meeting. Something about diversifying investments." I sighed. Charlotte Calloway, my father's second wife, had a way of presenting herself as the ever-concerned matriarch. But I knew better. Her interest in the company always seemed to align a little too closely with her son, Andrew's, ambitions. "I'll handle it," I said. "Don't worry." David hesitated. "You sure?" "I've dealt with Charlotte long enough to know when she's angling. This isn't new." David didn't look convinced, but he dropped it. Later that evening, I returned home to our estate perched above the coastline. The house was a relic of old money, marble floors, towering glass walls, and the hum of quiet opulence that echoed through empty rooms. Melissa was waiting for me on the balcony, the ocean breeze tugging at her dark hair. She was beautiful, graceful in the way that turned heads at galas and drew the envy of other wives. But there was distance in her eyes that hadn't always been there. "Long day?" she asked, pouring a glass of red wine. "Same as usual." I kissed her on the cheek, though she barely leaned into it. The facade was intact, but I could feel the cracks beneath it. I just hadn't decided if I wanted to peer inside. Melissa smiled faintly, but her eyes shifted toward the horizon. "Charlotte called me today. She wants to host a dinner for the family." "I know. David mentioned it." "She seems worried about the fleet's future," Melissa added carefully. "Charlotte's always worried," I replied, "especially when she thinks there's money on the table that she doesn't have her hands on." Melissa laughed lightly, but it sounded rehearsed. I placed my glass on the railing and faced her. "Is something bothering you?" She looked surprised, almost caught off guard, but masked it quickly. "No, of course not. Just tired, I suppose." I wanted to believe her, but even then, I could feel it, the faint tremor beneath the foundation of everything we had built. Charlotte's dinner came 2 nights later. The Calloway estate buzzed with the kind of tension that only came when too many powerful people were trapped under one roof. The dining hall was filled with family: David, Andrew, Melissa, and my younger children, Thomas and Emily. Charlotte sat at the head of the table, watching like a queen surveying her court. She was elegant, draped in pearls, but the sharpness in her gaze betrayed the warmth of her smile. "To the Calloway legacy," she toasted as wine glasses clinked. Melissa sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. She laughed at all the right moments, but I could feel her withdrawing, like she wasn't really there. Andrew, Charlotte's son, leaned in from across the table. "Dad would be proud of how you're running things," he said smoothly, though his eyes flicked toward David. "But some diversification wouldn't hurt." David set his glass down with just enough force to make a point. "The fleet's doing fine as is. We're growing faster than any of our competitors." Andrew smirked. "I'm just saying, stability is important, especially with the shifting market. Maybe it's time to take fewer risks." I could see where this was going. Andrew wasn't subtle. He'd always wanted a larger role in the company, but David was standing in his way. Charlotte, of course, said nothing. She didn't have to. I'll consider it, I said, ending the discussion. But David's eyes met mine across the table. We both knew what was happening beneath the surface. As the evening dragged on, I found Melissa stepping away, quietly slipping onto the terrace outside. I followed her, watching from the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Are you all right?" I asked, stepping beside her. She glanced at me, smiling faintly. "I just needed some air." I studied her carefully. "Melissa, if something's wrong, you can tell me." She opened her mouth as if to say something but stopped herself. Instead, she placed her hand over mine. "I'm fine, Ethan. Really." I wanted to believe her, but even as I held her hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. Beneath the surface, the cracks were starting to widen. The morning after Charlotte's dinner, I walked the length of the Calloway docks, hands tucked into the pockets of my coat. The sun was barely cresting over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the water, but my mind wasn't on the view. David met me near the Calloway Atlantic, his expression tight. "Andrew's been poking around the cargo logs," he said without preamble. I glanced at him, unsurprised. I expected as much. "I don't like it." David folded his arms, leaning against a stack of crates. "He's too focused on the smaller shipments, the stuff we usually don't pay much attention to." I frowned. Andrew had no business snooping around operations. His position was advisory at best, a concession I made years ago to keep Charlotte off my back. "Anything unusual?" I asked. "Not yet, but I'll keep an eye on it." I trusted David's instincts. He had been with the company long enough to recognize when something was amiss. As I turned to leave, David called after me. "You should know. Melissa left early this morning. Said she was heading into the city." I paused mid-step. "Did she say why?" David shook his head. "No, just thought you'd want to know." I didn't respond, but the unease from the night before returned. Melissa rarely left without telling me. When I arrived back at the estate, the house was quiet. I checked the usual places, her office, the garden, the upstairs reading room, but Melissa was gone. By noon, I gave up and sat at my desk, reviewing shipment manifests. The numbers blurred together, but my focus was shot. The faint hum of a car rolling into the driveway pulled me from the paperwork. I crossed to the window just as Melissa stepped out of the passenger side of a black Mercedes I didn't recognize. I stayed by the window, watching. She smoothed down her coat, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and glanced quickly at the driver. A man. I couldn't make out his face, but he lingered, exchanging quiet words with her before pulling away. Melissa entered the house as if nothing had happened. I was still standing by the window when she found me in my office a few minutes later. "Ethan," she greeted, as though she hadn't been gone half the day. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice calm but deliberate. She hesitated, just barely. "I went into town, met with a friend." I watched her carefully. "A friend?" "Yes. I needed some time away." I waited, giving her space to elaborate. She didn't. Melissa stepped forward, placing her hands on the edge of my desk. "Ethan, I know things have been tense lately. I just needed some breathing room. That's all." I nodded slowly, but the doubt didn't fade. "Of course," I replied. Her smile felt forced. That evening, David joined me for dinner at the estate, though Melissa stayed upstairs. The table felt too large with just the two of us. "She's been distant," David said quietly, as if reading my mind. I didn't respond immediately. "Your grandmother's been spending more time with her." David arched a brow. "Charlotte?" I nodded. "Melissa listens to her more than I'd like." David set his fork down, eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not a coincidence. You know that, right?" I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "She's always been good at sowing seeds of doubt," David continued. "First with Andrew, now Melissa. I think she's working toward something, Dad." I met his gaze across the table. "I know." The problem was, I didn't know what. A few days later, the first rail crack appeared. David and I were reviewing cargo manifests when he frowned at the tablet in his hands. "What is it?" I asked. "Something's off with the Calloway Pacific's manifest." A new shipment route was added last week, one I didn't approve. I leaned closer, scanning the log. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. A secondary shipment tacked onto a larger load, but the destination wasn't one of our usual ports. Who signed off on this? I asked. David swiped the screen, scrolling to the authorization section. The name stopped me cold. Melissa Calloway. She doesn't have access to sign off on shipping routes, David said carefully. She shouldn't, I replied. I set the tablet down, pulse ticking faster than it should. David hesitated. You think Andrew's behind this? I didn't answer, but in my gut, I knew David was right. It wasn't just Andrew. It was Charlotte, and Melissa was closer to them than I realized. That night, I sat in my office long after the house had gone to sleep. Melissa's signature on that shipment kept circling in my head. I opened my laptop and began digging deeper. David had flagged the route, but I traced it further, looking for patterns, connections. That's when I saw it. The shipment wasn't just unusual. It was illegal. Contraband goods, smuggled under our company's name, buried beneath layers of legitimate trade. The kind of operation that could sink Calloway shipping if exposed. The worst part wasn't that Andrew had orchestrated it. It was that Melissa had known and signed off on it. I closed the laptop, leaning back in my chair as the weight of it settled over me. Charlotte's fingerprints were all over this, but Melissa's betrayal cut the deepest. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about control of the company. It was personal. I didn't sleep that night. Melissa's signature on that shipping manifest burned in my mind long after I shut the laptop. I couldn't shake the weight of it. How casual it seemed. How easy it had been for her to betray me with the stroke of a pen. By dawn, I was back at the docks. The Calloway Pacific was preparing for departure, its crew moving like clockwork beneath the rising sun. I stood by the loading bay, watching the containers roll onto the ship. I recognized every inch of that vessel, the hours spent overseeing its construction, the years watching it cross oceans. But now, it felt different. David found me near the bow, clipboard in hand, his face tight. I pulled the full manifest from the office, he said, handing it to me. I scanned the list, mostly standard cargo. Agricultural equipment, textiles, electronics. But buried at the bottom was the shipment in question. Sealed cargo. No inspection required. It was a red flag, glaring in its simplicity. Who authorized the bypass on customs? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Andrew, David replied quietly. He submitted it through one of our third-party logistics partners. I clenched the clipboard tighter. Andrew had found a loophole. A dangerous one. David shifted beside me. We can stop it. All it takes is one call to port authorities. I shook my head. Not yet. David's brow furrowed. Why not? Because I want to know exactly who else is involved. Stopping this shipment now would draw attention, force Andrew and Charlotte to change their tactics. I needed to see how deep this ran, and the only way to do that was to let them think they were winning. David exhaled through his nose, but didn't argue. Later that day, I returned to the estate, expecting to find Melissa reading in the sunroom or tending to the garden. Instead, the house felt empty. I found her upstairs, seated at the vanity in our bedroom, brushing through her hair. Where were you this morning? I asked, leaning against the doorway. She met my reflection in the mirror, her hand pausing mid-stroke. I had errands, she said lightly, offering the same rehearsed smile I'd grown used to. Errands. Always vague. Always evasive. Melissa, I began carefully. Did you authorize that shipment on the Calloway Pacific? Her hand stilled completely. She set the brush down, meeting my gaze directly this time. I don't know what you're talking about. Lies. So effortlessly spun. I stepped further into the room, watching her closely. David found your signature on the paperwork. A flicker of something crossed her face. Fear, maybe, or annoyance that she'd been caught. It was a mistake, she said quickly. Andrew asked me to sign off on some routine documents. I didn't realize what it was for. I let the silence stretch. You expect me to believe that? Melissa's eyes hardened. Why wouldn't you? I stepped closer, voice lowering. Because you're smarter than that, Melissa. You don't sign things blindly, especially when Andrew's involved. She rose slowly, smoothing down the hem of her dress as if that would ground her. "I'm not your enemy, Ethan," she said softly. "I signed it to help the family." I searched her face, but all I saw was distance, the same wall that had been growing between us for months. "This isn't about the family," I replied coldly. "It's about Andrew and Charlotte." Melissa's eyes flicked away for just a moment, toward the window, toward the sea. "Be careful who you trust, Ethan," she whispered. For the first time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a threat. That evening, David and I sat in my office, papers spread across the desk. We reviewed shipping records, but every trail led back to Andrew and a handful of vague authorizations. "This isn't just about money," David said, flipping through the files. "They're moving something under our noses. I can feel it." I nodded. "Whatever it is, Charlotte's protecting it." David paused, narrowing his eyes at the ledger in front of him. "There's a secondary drop-off point listed on the Pacific's route," he said, pushing the paper toward me. "South of Havana. We don't usually deal with that port." I frowned. Smaller harbors make for easier offloading, less oversight. David tapped the document. "Exactly. It's the perfect place to run smuggling operations." It clicked into place faster than I expected. Andrew wasn't just cutting corners. He was running illegal cargo through Calloway ships. And Melissa was involved. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it settling on my chest. "Does Charlotte know about this?" David asked, his voice tense. "She has to. There was no way Andrew could orchestrate this without Charlotte's blessing. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was something deeper." David leaned forward. "So what do we do?" I met his gaze, steady. "We let the shipment sail. But when it docks, we'll be waiting." David nodded. "And Melissa?" I exhaled slowly, staring at the photo of our family on the desk, the one taken years ago, before the cracks began to show. "I'll handle Melissa," I said quietly, but as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure if I believed them. The storm broke 2 days later, though not in the way I had expected. David and I were set to leave for the Caribbean port at dawn. Our plan was airtight. The authorities had been briefed, and I had every piece of documentation needed to intercept the smuggled cargo before it could disappear under Andrew's web of false invoices and shadow routes. But the real betrayal surfaced closer to home. Melissa had been distant since our conversation in the garden, but I hadn't pressed. I told myself I'd deal with her after the shipment was handled. I thought I had more time. I was wrong. It started with a phone call late that night. I was in my office when I heard David's footsteps hurriedly approach. He entered without knocking, his phone clenched in his hand, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tense. He handed me his phone, a text thread open on the screen. At first, it didn't register. The texts were from Andrew, cryptic and short. But then I scrolled further, and a photo filled the screen. A blurry shot of Melissa stepping out of Andrew's car outside a medical clinic. One hand rested protectively on her stomach. The caption beneath it cut through me like ice. "Prenatal visit confirmed. Congratulations, brother." I set the phone down, exhaling slowly. "She's pregnant," David said, barely able to contain the disgust in his voice. "And it's Andrew's." The room was too quiet, save for the faint hum of the estate's heating system. I stared at the phone, feeling nothing for several long seconds. Then, the anger began to simmer, deep and steady. David sat across from me, watching closely. "What are you going to do?" I leaned back, forcing my hands to unclench. "She didn't tell me because she thought she could hide it," I said, voice flat. "She must have planned to leave after the smuggling operation was complete." David's jaw tightened. "She's playing both sides. I should have seen this sooner." "No," I replied firmly. "This isn't on you. It's on me." Melissa's betrayal wasn't just personal now. It was a direct threat to the company, the family, and everything we'd built. She and Andrew were carving pieces from the Calloway empire while I watched. And Charlotte? She had known all along. I found Melissa in our bedroom later that night. She was sitting at the vanity again, brushing through her hair with slow, methodical strokes. For a moment, I just watched her from the doorway, wondering if there had ever been a time when things were simple between us, or if that had always been an illusion. "Melissa," Her hand froze mid-brush. She met my eyes in the mirror, and something in her gaze shifted. She knew. You went to the clinic, I said quietly. Her shoulders tensed. She set the brush down carefully, turning to face me. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't, I snapped, the calm I had carefully constructed beginning to crack. Andrew sent David a photo. Her breath hitched, but to her credit, she didn't crumble. So what now? She asked softly. Is this the part where you scream at me? No, I replied coldly. This is the part where I remind you whose name is on this house. On the company. On everything you touch. Melissa's eyes darkened, but she didn't deny it. I know about the smuggling, I continued, stepping closer. And I know you're involved. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. You're carrying Andrew's child, I said, letting the weight of it hang between us. And you thought you'd leave after the shipment. Start over with him. I imagine Charlotte's already secured a quiet villa somewhere offshore for the two of you. Melissa's composure cracked just enough for me to see it. I exhaled slowly, the hurt buried beneath layers of something colder. You can leave tonight if you want. Her head snapped up. What? You heard me. Pack your things, take your car, and leave. She stared at me, searching for any sign of hesitation. There wasn't any. What about the children? She asked, her voice wavering. You won't see them again, I said sharply. Not after this. Not after Andrew. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't waver. I'll speak to Daniel Royce in the morning, I added, referencing our family lawyer. He'll handle the divorce. There won't be a dime for you. Melissa rose slowly, brushing past me toward the closet. For the first time, I saw the full measure of the distance between us. The woman I thought I knew, now nothing more than a stranger under my roof. She packed in silence. By the time I heard the car pull away from the estate, I was standing by the window, watching as the taillights disappeared down the long, winding road. David found me hours later, still in my office, staring blankly at the documents scattered across the desk. She's gone, I said simply. David lowered himself into the chair across from me. What now? I met his eyes. We end this, I said, voice like steel. Andrew, Charlotte, the smuggling. All of it. When that shipment reaches port, I want them to know exactly who took it from them. David nodded, leaning back in his chair. And for the first time in months, I felt in control again. By the time the Calloway Pacific crossed into Caribbean waters, the final pieces of my plan had already been set in motion. I stood in the quiet of my office, the heavy curtains drawn against the pale morning light. David was across from me, leaning forward, elbows braced on his knees. His focus was razor-sharp, the tension in his shoulders betraying the weight he carried. This won't just ruin Andrew, he said, his voice low. Charlotte's going to fight back hard. She can try, I replied, flipping open a leather folder containing the full scope of what we'd uncovered. But she doesn't know what I have. The shipment wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. Arms smuggled under the cover of trade goods, routed through small ports in exchange for untraceable cash. Andrew had been siphoning profits for months, aided by Melissa's quiet signatures and Charlotte's influence over the logistics teams. But their arrogance had been their downfall. Customs will intercept the Pacific tomorrow, I continued. I spoke with the Port Authority personally. Every inch of that ship is being searched. David nodded. What about Andrew? That's the best part, I said, a small, cold smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. He's flying in to oversee the cargo transfer himself. He'll be there when it all unravels. David's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, but there was still doubt lingering. And Melissa? He asked carefully. She's out, I said firmly. I made it clear she won't see the children, and Daniel is expediting the divorce paperwork. By the time this is over, she won't have a leg to stand on. David exhaled. She might try to come back when this falls apart. I met his gaze steadily. She won't. That evening, I made a call to an old contact, James Whitaker, a private investigator I'd used years ago when there were whispers of internal theft among our crew. Ethan, James greeted, his gruff voice crackling through the line. It's been a while. I have a job for you, I said, wasting no time. I need surveillance on Andrew Calloway for the next 48 hours. He's flying to the Caribbean. I want to know where he goes, who he meets, and what deals he tries to salvage when the shipment goes under. James was quiet for a beat. Sounds like you're planning something big. I am, I replied bluntly. Consider it done. The next morning, David and I boarded a private jet bound for the Caribbean. I wasn't going to let this unfold from a distance. I wanted to be there, to see the look on Andrew's face when the walls finally closed in. As we descended toward the port city, the sprawling harbor came into view beneath the rising sun. The Calloway Pacific was already docked, a looming figure against the bright turquoise waters. David stood at the window, eyes fixed on the ship. This ends today, I said, more to myself than to him. By midday, the trap was already closing. The Calloway Pacific's containers were lined up on the dock, waiting for inspection. Andrew stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, dressed in a crisp navy suit, as if he were about to broker some high-level trade deal. I watched from a distance, leaning against the black SUV we'd arrived in. He doesn't suspect a thing, David said quietly beside me. No, I replied, a grim satisfaction settling over me. But he will. As if on cue, the customs officers arrived in force. Trucks rolled onto the dock, and agents moved toward the cargo with purpose. I saw the confusion flicker across Andrew's face. He approached one of the officials, gesturing animatedly. His voice carried faintly across the wind, but I couldn't make out the words. A minute passed, then another. And finally, the lead customs officer unsealed one of the containers. Andrew took a step back, his body stiffening. I watched the realization sink in, the flash of panic that crossed his expression when the false panels were removed, revealing the illegal cargo hidden inside. Guns. Enough to bury him. David exhaled sharply beside me. They've got him. Andrew's voice rose in protest, but there was no escaping it now. I stepped forward, crossing the distance between us in measured strides. Andrew turned as I approached, fury etched across his face. This is you, he spat. You planned this. I stopped just a few feet away, hands tucked in my pockets. You did this to yourself, Andrew, I replied calmly. I just gave you enough rope to hang with. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You think this is over, he growled. You've humiliated me in front of the entire port. You've cost this family millions. I smiled thinly. It's not about the money. It's about making sure you never set foot near my company again. Andrew took a step closer, lowering his voice to a hiss. Charlotte will fix this, he warned. She'll protect me. I shook my head. No, she won't. By the time she hears about this, she'll be too busy dealing with the fallout. Andrew's bravado flickered. He realized, too late, that there was no saving him from this. As the customs officers placed him under arrest, I met David's gaze. It was done. Charlotte's reaction came swiftly, but it didn't matter. The evidence was undeniable. By the time she tried to intervene, the legal machinery was already in motion. Andrew was facing smuggling charges, and the Calloway fleet was cleared of any involvement. Melissa didn't return. I never expected her to. The estate was quieter in the days that followed, but it was a peaceful quiet. David and I walked the docks together, watching as the Calloway Pacific returned under new oversight. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my father's legacy settle firmly where it belonged, on my shoulders and David's. And I knew I could trust him to carry it forward. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Marble floors stretched out beneath rows of polished benches, and the distant echo of footsteps lingered long after the judge had entered. I sat at the plaintiff's table, Daniel Royce at my side. Across from us sat Melissa, her once pristine composure fraying at the edges. She looked thinner, more fragile than the last time I had seen her. Andrew's arrest and the public fallout had taken its toll. David sat quietly behind me in the second row, his presence steady and unwavering. Thomas and Emily, my youngest, weren't here. I'd chosen to keep them away from the proceedings, wanting to shield them from the uglier sides of this fight. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, peered down at us from the bench. This court has reviewed the evidence presented regarding the dissolution of Mr. and Mrs. Calloway's marriage and the custody of the minor children, she began, her voice even but firm. Melissa shifted in her seat, but I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes forward, waiting. Mr. Calloway, the judge continued, due to overwhelming evidence of misconduct, including involvement in illegal smuggling operations and falsifying company records, the court awards you sole custody of your children. Melissa exhaled sharply, as if the wind had been knocked from her chest. As for Mrs. Calloway, the judge added, turning her attention to Melissa, this court finds her complicit in fraudulent activity and therefore unfit for custodial privileges. Mrs. Calloway will retain limited supervised visitation rights, pending a psychological evaluation. Daniel's hand rested lightly on my arm in silent victory. Melissa's gaze finally met mine, and for the first time in months, I saw something I hadn't expected, regret. But regret didn't undo betrayal. The judge's gavel struck, finalizing the divorce. It was over. The estate felt different after that. Melissa's things had been cleared out within a week, and every trace of her involvement in the company had been wiped clean. David and I spent long hours reshaping the leadership at Calloway Shipping, cutting ties with those who had been too close to Andrew and Charlotte's schemes. Charlotte's influence waned quickly after Andrew's conviction. She attempted to save face with the board, but no amount of manipulation could undo the damage. She withdrew quietly to a vacation home in Europe, far from the docks where she once held court. Andrew remained behind bars, awaiting sentencing. Life with the kids settled into a new rhythm. Emily, bright and full of questions, spent most afternoons in my office after school. She would sit across from me, sketching or reading, occasionally asking about the ships we owned and the places they traveled. Thomas, quieter and more reserved, preferred the docks. David often took him along for inspections, teaching him about the machinery and logistics that kept the Calloway fleet running. I could already see the same fire in Thomas's eyes that David had at his age. One evening, after dinner, Emily lingered at the table while Thomas headed to his room. "Dad," she asked, twirling a pencil between her fingers, "is Mom going to come back?" I set my glass down, carefully considering the answer. "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "She's not." Emily nodded, as if she had already expected that answer. "Will we see her again?" I leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe one day. But right now, it's better for us to be here, together." She smiled faintly. "I like it when it's just us." I smiled back, heart swelling with quiet relief. Months passed, and the company thrived under new leadership. David officially stepped into a senior executive role, his natural instincts guiding the fleet into new, more legitimate trade routes. Investors, once shaken by the scandal, slowly returned, drawn by the Calloway name and the promise of stability. On David's 33rd birthday, I handed him the keys to the Calloway Atlantic, the same ship he had watched roll into port as a child. "It's yours now," I told him, as we stood on the bridge of the freighter. David looked out over the water, the sun dipping low on the horizon. "You built this," he said softly. I shook my head. "No, we built this." His hand tightened around the keys, and for the first time in years, I felt the certainty that the Calloway legacy was in good hands. As we watched the ship pull away from the dock, I realized something else. Betrayal didn't break me. It refined me. And standing beside my children, watching the Calloway fleet sail under calm skies, I knew we were stronger than ever. A year passed before I heard anything new about Melissa. She had given birth to Andrew's child quietly, far from the city where our lives had unraveled. The news came through distant whispers, relayed by acquaintances or former staff who still kept tabs on her whereabouts. She was living in a small provincial town along the California coast, miles away from the luxury she once basked in. Andrew's absence loomed over her like a shadow. I knew she was struggling. After everything that had happened, she was left with nothing. No stake in Calloway Shipping, no inheritance, and no support from Charlotte. But I wasn't heartless. As much as I wanted to sever every thread that connected us, I couldn't let the mother of my children starve. Through Daniel, I arranged a quiet monthly stipend, enough to keep her afloat but not enough for comfort. It was anonymous, wired through third-party accounts. Melissa never asked about it, nor did she reach out. Perhaps she was too ashamed. Andrew wasn't as lucky. His trial had dragged on for months, each hearing painting a clearer picture of the smuggling operation he had orchestrated through Calloway shipping. By the time the full extent of the charges was laid bare, even Charlotte had stopped advocating for him. He wasn't just moving illegal cargo. Andrew had been trafficking arms to unstable regions, knowingly supplying weapons to factions involved in organized crime. The shipments uncovered on the Calloway Pacific were just the tip of the iceberg, enough to trigger investigations that unraveled deeper layers of corruption. But the final blow came when federal prosecutors uncovered evidence tying him to human trafficking routes operating through secondary ports in South America. He hadn't just risked the company's reputation. He had knowingly engaged in one of the most reprehensible crimes imaginable. Andrew never stood a chance in court. The jury convicted him on multiple counts: arms trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy, and human trafficking. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Rumor had it, Andrew's arrogance hadn't faded even after the sentencing. He clung to the belief that Charlotte's influence might save him in the end. But Charlotte never came. She stopped visiting by the second month of his imprisonment. Their plan had always been simple: power and wealth. Andrew wanted more than his advisory role at Calloway Shipping. He wanted full control of the company, convinced that I was too cautious, too unwilling to take risks that could catapult the fleet into higher profits. Charlotte, his unwavering accomplice, believed in his vision. She thought by destabilizing me, manipulating Melissa, sowing seeds of distrust, and creating chaos within the company, she could maneuver Andrew into a leadership position. Melissa was collateral. Her affair with Andrew had been part seduction, part manipulation. Charlotte likely convinced Melissa that she would share in Andrew's success, that she'd step into a position of wealth and power once I was pushed out. But they underestimated me. Andrew's greed blinded him to the reality that Calloway Shipping wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a tightly woven dynasty that couldn't be unraveled by shallow schemes and backdoor deals. Reports of Melissa's new child stirred something unexpected in me. I wasn't sure if it was anger, pity, or relief. She was raising Andrew's child alone now, living off government benefits and the small amount I sent. Charlotte had washed her hands of the situation entirely. I sometimes wondered if she regretted her choices. If she ever sat in that small house, rocking Andrew's child to sleep, and thought back to the life she threw away. I doubted I'd ever know the answer. And honestly, I wasn't sure I cared. As for Charlotte, she faded into quiet exile. After Andrew's conviction, she retreated to a small estate in Spain, rarely making public appearances. Her influence over the Calloway board evaporated, and with Andrew gone, she no longer had a foothold in the company. She tried reaching out once, some weak attempt at reconciliation masked under the guise of family unity. I didn't respond. David had been clear. Charlotte was never to step foot near the company or our family again. I agreed. The Calloway name needed to heal, and that meant severing the parts that had poisoned it. One day, long after the dust had settled, I drove past the small coastal town where Melissa now lived. I didn't stop or reach out, but I saw her from a distance, walking down the narrow streets with Andrew's child bundled against her chest. She looked ordinary. No trace of the woman who once graced magazine covers beside me at galas. No jewelry. No fine dresses. Just a tired woman carrying the weight of her choices. And in that moment, I felt nothing. No hatred. No satisfaction. Just a quiet acceptance that the life we once shared was gone, and I had no desire to reclaim it. I left the town behind, driving back toward the estate where Emily and Thomas waited for me. David stood at the docks when I returned, watching the ships roll in. "How was the drive?" he asked. "Uneventful," I replied. David nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a second longer. "She made her choices," I added quietly. "And so did we." David clapped me on the shoulder, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You did right by the family, Dad. That's all that matters." As we watched the Calloway fleet stretch along the horizon, I knew he was right. Melissa's chapter in our lives was closed. But the Calloway legacy? It was just beginning. If the people you trusted most betrayed you, would you choose to destroy them completely or leave room for forgiveness? When protecting your family and legacy, how far would you go to ensure the truth comes to light, even if it meant exposing painful secrets to the world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to Cheating Storytelling so you never miss an update on more real-life stories. And as always, see you in the next video.